Hello and welcome to our Week 7 overview lecture in the politics theme. This is our second week. The readings this week are overwhelmingly texts that were written for general public consumption. They're interventions in news magazines, most of them, rather than academic articles. I've given you in the supplemental lectures some recordings or videos that are produced by third parties that show some of the figures that we're reading this week, talking about their own arguments, so that may give you some additional insight. But I've left you on your own for supplemental lectures this week. I'll just go over in the overview the readings that we're looking at and how they fit into the course, and I think based on what we've covered so far, you'll be okay without the more detailed information from the supplementals. But let me know if you found a reading particularly difficult. So we have three topics that we're looking at this week. It's not quite as massive a set of material as last week, but it's still pretty big. We're looking at developments in liberal theory, and specifically we're looking at the concept of the social contract, which we've analyzed in previous weeks, and we've already seen criticisms of the issue of who the social contract is understood to include and who it doesn't include. Our texts this week are going to include a major attempt to reconceptualize how we think about the social contract by John Rawls, and then some critical responses to Rawls's work. We're also going to take a look at developments in conservatism, both attempts to define conservatism in the mid-20th century in America and in England, and we're going to look at neoconservatism as a more contemporary political movement and see how that fits into the conservative tradition. We're also going to revisit Benedict Anderson's argument about imagined communities and take a look at some texts that are asking how these imagined communities and their supposed alignment with nation states is holding up in a period of renewed globalization. So in terms of our first topic, this is the topic where more of the texts are academic than others. However, they're still written in a relatively accessible way, so I've not recorded supplementals, but a couple of the figures in this section have their own recordings that you can take a look at, particularly Charles Mills and Amartya Sen. So if you're looking for some additional support for readings in this topic, I might suggest that you take those readings up and take a look at the video material to provide a better sense of what's going on with the argument. Everyone in this topic is engaging with Rawls, and so Rawls is one of our texts. Rawls is a significant political theorist, and in the work that we have, he is reflecting on his very important, massive book called A Theory of Justice. So he's condensed the argument from A Theory of Justice down, and I'll summarize it briefly here so that you get a feel for what the other texts that we're reading are playing off against, what they're criticizing. So Rawls is seeking a concept of justice for constitutional democracies that is better grounded than utilitarianism. So he thinks that we're relying heavily on utilitarian understandings of how our democracies work, and that we need something more appropriate than that. And one of the reasons we need something more appropriate than that is that we've become increasingly aware of a tension within liberal theory, and this is something that you've already seen in our readings from previous weeks, between principles of equality and principles of liberty. So the freedom to do things and mutual equality, both as things that are presupposed, but that have played out in tension with one another. It's hard to figure out what kind of institutions you should put together that will maximize both of these things in the best possible way. And Rawls doesn't think that utilitarianism is going to provide enough of a guidance. He says that political theory in democratic societies has a very specific task. It's trying to establish a basis for mutual agreement that enables political cooperation. And in the beginning of the article, he's worrying a lot about the fact that he has been read, and he thinks he's been misread, as trying to talk about sort of timeless truths buried in human nature for political systems. And he says, that's not what I'm doing at all. I'm assuming that we're talking about democratic societies, and what I'm trying to do is to make explicit things that are presupposed in the general culture, in popular culture, in democratic societies. I'm trying to make these things explicit so that they can become a public basis for mutual understanding and respect that can then provide a sort of foundation for us to talk about the justness of our political institutions. And he proposes this concept that what justice is fairness. And this is not the first time, probably not the last time, that he writes an article with justice as fairness in the title. It's a central concept that he keeps returning to and refining. Here he talks about two key principles, one of which is that each person has the equal right to a scheme of equal basic rights and liberties. So everybody's meant in principle to have equal access to a framework of basic rights and liberties. And if the society you end up with, if the institutions you create involve social inequalities, those inequalities can only be legitimate, they can only be rationalized in the circumstance where the society itself guarantees equality of opportunity. So there's equality of opportunity to end up in any of the various social positions that come available. And the inequalities that exist provide the greatest benefit for the least advantaged members of society. Okay, and those are his conditions. He focuses a lot in this piece on the need for a concept of justice that is essentially not metaphysical or epistemological. He says he doesn't want something that floats timelessly outside of society. He's interested in what he calls a publicly recognized point of view from which all citizens can examine before one another whether or not their political or social institutions are just. Okay, so he wants a kind of generally recognized standard that people can adopt without having to assert that this standard is religious in character or that it would be accepted in all possible human societies. He's talking about specifically something that is part of the fabric, the implicit fabric of democratic societies. Okay, and he calls the approach he's taking Kantian constructivism. Okay, we've talked about constructivism in previous weeks. He's talking about something that is constructed out of our practices, but constructed out of our practices, it enables that Kantian process that we've also discussed in previous weeks of publicly discussing and debating and disputing to come up with what the rational outcome ought to be. Okay, so he says the aim is practical. It is not metaphysical or epistemological. It presents itself not as a conception of justice that is true, but one that can serve as the basis of informed and willing political agreement between citizens viewed as free and equal persons. So he's not saying that human nature itself means that we are free and equal. He's trying not to make these kind of metaphysical statements that we've seen in some classical liberal texts. This is a practical argument. It is a perspective that we can adopt on ourselves, and he thinks it is a familiar perspective because this is how we behave intuitively in our everyday popular culture in democratic societies. And he says to secure this agreement, so the agreement that's going to provide the basis for our public discussion of correct political institutions, we try so far as we can to avoid disputed philosophical as well as disputed moral and religious questions, because there's no way to resolve them politically. The only alternative to a principle of toleration is the autocratic use of state power. And he's trying to come up with something that is not autocratic, that is compatible with democracy. He says philosophy as the search for truth about an independent metaphysical and moral order cannot, I believe, provide a workable and shared basis for a political conception of justice in a democratic society. So again, not looking for something that floats above or outside the society in some way, but something that emerges from within it. And he says that this project is an attempt to recast the ideas from the tradition of the social contract to achieve a practicable conception of objectivity and justification founded on public agreement in judgment on due reflection. The aim is free agreement reconciliation through public reason. So this concept of reconciliation through public reason, which we've encountered in Kant earlier in this term, but trying to do something with the social contract tradition, which, as we've discussed, has problematic elements to it. It's founded in notions of European experience of other societies that were perceived to predate the formation of social institutions, because the social institutions that were there didn't resemble European institutions. He is suggesting that there's a way to hang on to that concept of social contract, hang on to the notion that we can enter into some sort of agreement or rational process of discussion aiming toward agreement about our political institutions without some of these problematic elements in the older tradition. So he starts from ideas that he thinks are implicit already in our existing social structures, in our habitus, in our way of being in the world, that we have intuitive ideas of society as a fair system of cooperation between free and equal persons. He's not saying that society as it currently exists is that fair system, but that we intuitively have a feeling that it should be possible that a legitimate society would be a fair system of cooperation between free and equal persons, and that citizens are defined as free and equal persons. As citizens, we're not an aristocracy. We don't have intrinsic hierarchies among people. And he says, you have to do this, you have to try to create this structure by idealizing and simplifying in various ways. And these idealizations and simplifications are what some of our other authors in this topic are going to go after roles for. He says, this is done to achieve a clear and uncluttered view of what for us is the fundamental question of political justice, namely what is the most appropriate conception of justice for specifying the terms of social cooperation between citizens regarded as free and equal persons. Okay, so what kind of concept of justice can we have that's going to guide us when we try to figure out how we're going to cooperate with one another, what kind of institutions we're going to form, assuming that we accept that we should be free and equal, and as normal and fully cooperating members of society over a complete life. It is this question that has been the focus of the liberal critique of aristocracy, of the socialist critique of liberal constitutional democracy, and of the conflict between liberals and conservatives at the present time over the claims of private and legitimacy in contrast to the effectiveness of social policies associated with the so-called welfare state. Okay, so conflicts between principles of private property and the legitimacy of state intervention intended to ensure greater equality. Okay, and then he gets to a concept that is quite important and that you'll see referred to in a number of the other readings in this section, this concept of the veil of ignorance. And the veil of ignorance is a hypothetical, original position. So we're no longer going to assume that there was a point way back in time when humans weren't part of societies and they were all sort of individuals wandering around in a state of nature, and then they came together and formed a society. The veil of ignorance is a hypothetical position. It's something that we can try to think ourselves into now, but that's not presupposed to ever exist. And the idea behind the veil of ignorance is that if someone were to lay out to you a set of social institutions and say, you are going to be part of the society that has those institutions, but you don't know what part of that society you're going to be. Okay? A just society is the society you would be willing to join, knowing its institutions, knowing whatever inequalities that it has, and being satisfied that whatever role you end up with in that society would be fair. Okay, so it's meant to take away the advantages we have where we're happy with society as it is because we've gotten a lucky roll of the dice, we're relatively wealthy, we're relatively educated, we are part of a privileged group of people. The veil of ignorance is meant to say, would you actually be willing, would you think this society is fair if you had no idea what kind of body you were going to occupy, where in the world, under what circumstances, with whatever level of wealth? Okay? If you don't think it's fair, then it poses the possibility for critical reflection on the kinds of institutions that should replace existing institutions. Okay, so that's our background. And then we have other authors that are reacting to these proposals in different ways. We've got a quite brief piece by Charles Mills. There's also an excellent video by him that goes into his position in more detail. He's providing in the piece that we're reading an analysis of white supremacy as what he calls an unacknowledged political system. So we outline political systems and we talk about things like democracy or autocracy or totalitarianism or the rest. He talks about white supremacy as a political system that is not treated as such. And he talks about it in terms of something he calls the racial contract. Okay, so we talk about social contracts and we act like we have disembodied people. But when we get to the embodied world, there are racial differences and there are political implications to those differences. And he's going to talk about the problems that this poses for various kinds of social contract theories. We have a very long piece by Robert Nozick. A number of you liked his quote in the very first week. He was the person talking about how there was a real problem with many existing forms of political theory in that they try to hide the complexity of putting the theory together and how contingent it is, and they try to shove everything into neat categories and take a quick snapshot of those categories, and everything falls apart as soon as that snapshot is taken, but at that moment it looks perfect. And Nozick kind of makes fun of that and says that's not what he wants to do. This particular piece is a chunk of a much longer argument, and that longer argument is where that passage in week 1 came from. Although it is very long, it is very funny, and it's not so difficult to read. There's a bit in the middle that's a bit formalized, and you can skip past that if you're tackling this piece for this week. But it is a very funny look at roles, also at Locke, at conceptions, classical conceptions of what the basis is for private property, and whether these conceptions are useful or what better conceptions would be. And it is a particular kind of libertarian critique, arguing in favor of a minimalist state and against some of the notions of distributive justice that are found in roles and other political figures. There's a piece by Carol Pateman that is doing a feminist critique of social contract theory, focusing on the power that men exercise over women in what she calls the sexual contract. This is actually a piece that inspires the piece by Mills, so these two are somewhat related. And again, looking at the idea that social contract theories tend to have a hypothetical disembodied person at the base of them, and arguing that there are things that you miss from that disembodied perspective, that there are things that are not captured, assuming that you can think about the society from outside the society. And then we have a March of Sen. We also have a video of Sen talking about his piece, so if you want some more detail on his views, you can go to that. He's writing a sympathetic critique of Rawls, which, among other things, provides a summary of Rawls' arguments. So by reading him, you get a little bit of a feel for Rawls, as well as for the critique of Rawls. He's highlighting tensions that are internal to Rawls's arguments, as well as problems that he thinks arise when you try to apply Rawls's concepts to a real world, which has enormous differences in wealth, which has social actors who are not consistently rational, and other factors like this that complicate our analysis of how we're going to come together and talk with each other about what would be just and fair social institutions. So that's this first topic. It is extending this debate that we began talking about in week 3 about classical liberalism, notions of social contract theory, and some of the tensions within classical liberalisms that point toward different governmental implications. Okay, so it's some of those debates pursued a little later in time than what we've looked at before. Our second topic's on different kinds of conservatism and ways in which conservatism is redefined in both America and in England, in the case of the readings we've got this week, in the mid-20th century, and then what we mean by neoconservatism, this slightly more recent term that has been fairly prominent in the last decade and a bit. So we've got Russell Kirk, which is a key American text in the revival of what's called Burkean conservatism. We read a bit of Burke in week 3, and it might be worth, if you've not looked at that closely, it might be worth taking a look at that reading again, or taking a look at the lecture on classical liberalism and its critics again. This piece sets out 10 core principles of conservative belief, and it's interesting, if you can, to read more than one of the conservative selections to contrast them, because there is great diversity within conservatism as there is within liberalism, and to get a feel for the different strands from these different readings. One of his concluding points is the great line of demarcation in modern politics is not a division between liberals on the one side and totalitarians on the other. No, on one side of that line are all those men and women who fancy that the temporal order is the only order, and that material needs are their only needs, and that they may do as they like with the human patrimony. On the other side of that line are all those people who recognize an enduring moral order in the universe, a constant human nature, and high duties toward the order spiritual and the order temporal. Okay, so there's a particular vision of conservatism and what it is conserving, what it is trying to preserve. Michael Oakeshott with a significantly different take, and again these two pieces are interesting to contrast, different conception of government and what conservatism is trying to conserve. Government then, as the conservative in this matter understands it, does not begin with a vision of another, different and better world, but with the observation of the self-government practices, even by men of passion, in the conduct of their enterprises. Thus, governing is recognized as a specific and limited activity, not the management of the enterprise, but the rule of those engaged in a great diversity of self-chosen enterprises. It is not concerned with moral right and wrong. It is not designed to make men good or even better. It is not indispensable on account of the natural depravity of mankind, but merely because of their current disposition to be extravagant. Its business is to keep its subjects at peace with one another in the activities in which they have chosen to seek their happiness. Because the vocabulary is quite different here between the two. So again, we'll have a discussion in class about these different visions. We also have Friedrich von Hayek with a piece titled Why I'm Not a Conservative, which I could have put up with the liberals up above, but since everyone else was debating Rawls, I've put him down here. He is defining what conservatism is and what it's trying to conserve. He regards his position as a liberal one, as a defense of a particular kind of liberalism. He says the problem is that this is an era when most movements that are thought to be progressive advocate further encroachments on individual liberty. So he finds himself allied with conservatives, but he thinks this is a quite contingent alliance that has to do with essentially the advance of the welfare state. And we'll return to Hayek and we'll talk a little bit more about the welfare state and what it means when we do our economics topic in a few weeks. But in this piece, he tries to articulate a particular, quite different view of liberalism and his own take on what conservatism is. And then we have Samuel Huntington. We have a couple of readings from Huntington this week. In this particular one, he's outlining and criticizing different theories of conservatism, different explanations for why it happens. He's providing his own explanation of conservatism and why it arises. And he's exploring the possibility for an American conservatism in the mid-20th century and reacting on Kirk. Then we have some reading selections for neoconservatism as part of the same topic. We have Jean Kirkpatrick. This particular piece is a foundation text around U.S. foreign policy, and particularly suggesting that there is a foreign policy basis for supporting autocratic governments that are friendly to U.S. interests in situations where stable democracy seems unlikely. Okay, it's a critique of the foreign policy of the Carter administration, and it's often viewed as a foundational text for neoconservative thinking of a particular kind about U.S. foreign policy. There's Irving Kristol, who gets nicknames like the godfather of neoconservatism. He's a foundational figure for the movement, and in this piece, he's reflecting on whether and to what extent it's possible to articulate clear distinguishing principles for the movement. And then Adam Wolfson, who's analysing neoconservatism in the context of other forms of conservatism, trying to place it into historical context. Okay, so certainly in my tutorial group, probably in the others, there have been questions in various weeks about whether this or that position or this or that figure should be classified as neoconservative. These readings will give us a chance to talk about that with relation to some of the texts of the movement itself. And then we have a set of texts that are rethinking the issue of nationalism in light of the current round of globalization. We have Arjun Appadurai, who is engaging with Benedict Anderson's analysis of nationalism. Most of these texts are engaging with that on some level or another, saying that it needs to be rethought in the wake of current technologies and global networks. So Anderson, if you remember, has this concept that you get print capitalism and that it promotes the development of national vernacular cultures, or sort of everyday speeches in particular languages. And Appadurai says, look, you ain't seen nothing yet. The technologies we've got now for communication go well beyond what print capitalism would make available, and they point in different directions. And this creates new kinds of tensions between the concepts of a nation or nationhood and the geographically bounded territorial states that Anderson is looking at. Okay, so he's going to talk about some of the possibilities and some of the tensions with current technologies. Anthony Appiah is analyzing the diversity within Africa and the tensions that are created by racialized forms of nationalism that he thinks are inherited to some degree from the colonizers from Europe, and the potentials for Pan-African solidarity that can transcend particular kinds of racial and racist concepts in the current period. Buchanan and Pauja are reconsidering Anderson's argument again in light of the growing tensions between the nation and the territorial state, looking particularly at the way in which territorial states have been weakened by globalization, but also asking the question about legal frameworks. They regard legal frameworks as something that Anderson has relatively neglected in looking at formative principles for nation states, and asking what happens with these legal frameworks, which are still largely national, but we also have international legal frameworks of growing importance, and what this does with notions of nationhood, where nationhood may not quite align with the territorial state. And then we have Mark Juergensmeyer, who's looking at the issue of nationalism as a secular ideology. It's often something that suppressed various forms of religion when it came into being, and saying that this is actually a historical anomaly. It's very unusual and fairly short-lived, the period historically where you had these secular nationalisms that largely suppressed religious movements within political culture, and is exploring the question of whether there might be new forms of religious nationalism on the rise. And this is a topic that we'll revisit in some later periods of the course as well. Also under this topic, we've got a bit of the debate over the clash of civilizations argument, and this is something that most of you will have seen in the news, in popular culture, in various ways. We're going to take a look at Samuel Huntington's article that sparked this debate. This article is itself actually partially a response to a piece by Francis Fukuyama that we'll take a look at a little bit later in the course, titled The End of History and the Last Man. This article was also developed into a book. This is a more succinct expression of the piece. But his thesis is that the fundamental source of conflict in this new world, the new world being the post-Cold War era, will not be primarily ideological or primarily economic. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict will be cultural. Nation-states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups of different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will dominate global politics. The fault lines between civilizations will be the battle lines of the future. And he says, the central axis of world politics in the future is likely to be, in Kishore Mahbubani's phrase, the conflict between the West and the rest, as we know that phrase is an older origin point, and the responses of non-Western civilizations to Western power and values. So we've got Huntington's piece outlining his argument, and then we've got a couple of critical responses to it. One of them is by Mahbubani himself, that Huntington mentions in that phrase, critically reacting to Huntington, analyzing why the West appears threatening to others. In other words, why there are some ways to explain some of the phenomena that Huntington is concerned with without evoking the concept of a clash of civilizations, but just looking in more practical terms about political power relations in recent history. Edward Said, also critically responding to Huntington, arguing that Huntington is ignoring internal diversity within the things that he's calling civilizations, as well as trends that are happening that are cutting across the boundaries between different parts of the world that Huntington treats as distinct civilizations. Both Mahbubani and Said are people that we will run into again later in the course. So those are your reading options. With a number of these, I've put in videos of the author themselves speaking about or being interviewed or in discussions of their thesis here. So Huntington and Said are here, as well as some of the figures earlier. But I think the readings themselves are quite manageable without me breaking it down point by point. As I said, most of these were part of the public debate. So we'll see how we go, and let me know if things were a bit difficult.